My name is Diana Lawrence. I am 25 years old, and I had just survived 3 years of law school on black coffee and sheer spite. I was standing on a busy Manhattan sidewalk when the New York Board of Law Examiners portal finally loaded on my phone. One word in bold black text appeared on the screen: pass. I had cleared the hardest bar exam in the country. My hands shook as I dialed the number I had known by heart since childhood. My mother answered on the third ring. Her voice was distracted, drowned out by the metallic clatter of shopping carts. I told her the news. I told her I did it. I told her. There was a pause on the line. Then she sighed and said, "Oh, that is nice, honey. Listen, I am at the design center with your sister Ashley. We are trying to finalize the wallpaper for her new guest suite in the Hamptons. Bradley wants the renovations done by Thanksgiving. Can we do a dinner to celebrate next weekend or maybe the week after?" She chose guest room wallpaper over the biggest achievement of my life. I didn't yell. I just told her that was fine and hung up the phone. A week later, the man whose house they were decorating would be federally indicted for wire fraud, and I would be the lead associate building the prosecution case against him. Welcome to Orange Vengeance, where quiet endurance meets undeniable proof, and the truth always collects its debts. If you appreciate justice served cold, settle in. Drop a comment telling me your age and where you are listening from, and be sure to subscribe. Let me back up to the moment I hung up that phone. The October wind was biting off the East River. People brushed past my shoulders, bankers and couriers moving quickly through the financial district, while I stood frozen with a dark phone screen in my palm. I pocketed the device and started walking. I refused to cry. Crying was a luxury you couldn't afford when you were raised as the spare child in a family that operated like a balance sheet. 3 blocks down, tucked between towering glass high-rises, sat a place called the Oak and Gavel. It was a remnant of old New York, a historic pub favored by federal judges and seasoned litigators who preferred their conversations off the record. I pushed through the heavy brass doors. The air smelled like aged leather and expensive scotch. Muffled negotiations drifted from the high-backed booths. I took a seat at the far end of the mahogany bar, the polished surface cool under my hands. A man in his late 50s with sharp, observant eyes and a starched white apron walked over. His brass name tag read Mac. He wiped the counter with methodical strokes and asked what I was having. I ordered a club soda with lime. Mac set the glass down a moment later. The ice clinked in the quiet room. He studied me. He took in my rigid posture and my thrifted blazer that didn't quite belong in a room full of bespoke suits. "You have the look of someone marking an occasion," Mac said, his voice a low gravel. "But you are drinking soda and you are sitting alone. Care to clarify?" I traced the rim of the glass. I told him I had just found out I passed the New York bar exam. Mac raised a gray eyebrow. He told me that warranted champagne, not club soda, and asked where my cavalry was. I told him my mother was picking out wallpaper with my sister and asked to reschedule. Mac didn't offer pity. He didn't give me a hollow platitude. He reached beneath the bar and picked up a corded landline phone. He punched in a short extension. "It is Mac," he said into the receiver, his eyes never leaving mine. "I have hungry talent sitting down here. First-generation grit just passed the bar and currently realizes she has nothing to lose." He hung up the phone and pushed a small bowl of mixed nuts toward me. He told me to drink my soda. 5 minutes later, the heavy oak doors at the back of the pub swung open and the trajectory of my entire life changed. I watched the condensation run down the side of my club soda glass. A single drop traced an erratic path through the moisture pooling on the polished mahogany counter. The heavy oak doors at the back of the pub had swung open, but I did not turn around right away. I let the ambient noise of the room wash over me, absorbing the clinking ice and low murmurs of corporate litigation being dissected over expensive scotch. I needed a second to collect myself. My mother brushing off my bar exam results to pick out wallpaper was not a sudden betrayal. It was merely the latest entry in a ledger that had been meticulously balanced since my childhood. To understand why I felt no surprise sitting alone on the biggest day of my professional life, You have to understand the economy of the Lawrence family. In our household, affection was treated like a finite resource allocated strictly according to projected returns. My older sister Ashley was the blue chip stock. She possessed a magnetic charm, a polished smile, and a natural inclination for the spotlight. When Ashley announced during her junior year of high school that she wanted to be an attorney, my parents treated the declaration like a royal decree. They restructured their savings to pay for premium test prep tutors who charged exorbitant hourly rates. They funded a private undergraduate education that rivaled the gross domestic product of a small island nation. Ashley was their golden ticket, the daughter destined to conquer the legal world, secure a corner office, and validate their entire parenting strategy. I was the spare. I was the quiet, observant child who learned early that my needs were an inherent inconvenience. While Ashley attended immersive seminars in Connecticut to boost her scores, I checked out outdated study guides from the municipal library. I highlighted pages until the ink bled through the cheap yellowed paper. I worked double shifts at a local diner, smelling of fried food and stale coffee, to pay my own way through a state university. Nobody celebrated my grades. My father viewed my academic focus as a peculiar hobby, a fleeting phase I would eventually outgrow when I realized my limitations. When I secured a full academic ride to a respectable mid-tier law school in New York through relentless grit, the dinner conversation that night revolved around Ashley acquiring a new purebred puppy. The irony was that Ashley never became a lawyer. During her senior year of college, she decided the grueling study hours conflicted with her social calendar. She dropped out. There was no outrage from my parents. There were no stern lectures about squandered potential or wasted tuition money. Instead, they seamlessly pivoted their investment strategy because Ashley had introduced them to Bradley. Bradley was a real estate developer with a penchant for imported Italian suits, leased luxury cars, and grand sweeping promises. He spoke in rapid-fire buzzwords about emerging markets, zoning acquisitions, and venture capital. My parents adored him instantly. He was the flashy success story they had always craved, and Ashley had secured him. Her abandonment of law school was retroactively deemed a brilliant strategic maneuver to focus on her high society future. The true depth of my invisibility crystallized during my first year of law school. It was late April and the pressure was suffocating. I was drowning in preparation for my contract's final. The stakes were non-negotiable. If I lost my scholarship, my legal career ended before it began. I had no safety net. I sat at our cramped kitchen table in Queens, surrounded by towering stacks of casebooks, legal pads, and color-coded highlighters. My spine ached from hunching over the dense text of common law precedents. I was parsing the microscopic nuances of promissory estoppel, desperately trying to burn the rulings into my exhausted brain. My eyes burned from lack of sleep, and my stomach churned with anxiety. My parents chose that exact afternoon to plan Ashley's wedding. They spread glossy, oversized brochures for Caribbean resorts directly across the table from my open textbooks. The kitchen smelled of expensive catering samples they had brought home to taste rich roasted quail and truffle risotto. My mother animatedly discussed floral arrangements, debating the merits of imported orchids versus traditional white roses, her voice rising in pitch with every minor detail. My father leaned over a glowing spreadsheet, calculating deposits for a 5-piece jazz band and a premium open bar. Neither of them lowered their voices. Neither of them acknowledged the mountain of work I was attempting to conquer mere inches away. They laughed and pointed at photographs of beachfront cabanas, their joy loud and expansive, suffocating my concentration. At one point, the noise became intolerable. I quietly asked if they could move the planning to the living room so I could focus on reading the final appellate decision for my outline. My mother looked at me as if I had spoken in a forgotten language. She sighed an exhalation thick with profound theatrical burden. She told me I was being unreasonable and selfish. She said Ashley only gets married once, and I was letting my academic stress ruin a joyful family moment. My father did not even look up from his financial printouts. He simply reached across the table, shoving my heavy torts textbook out of the way to make room for a massive seating chart. He told me to go study in my bedroom if the real world was too distracting for me. I gathered my heavy books, retreated to my cramped room, and shut the thin wooden door. I sat on the edge of my bed and realized a fundamental truth. My ambition was an annoyance to them. It demanded attention they had already allocated elsewhere. In the Lawrence family, love was a strict budget, and my line item was permanently set to 0. Every accomplishment I achieved was viewed not with pride, but as a subtle insult to Ashley, a glaring reminder of the path she had abandoned. My isolation was not an accident or a simple oversight. It was a meticulously maintained family structure, a structural necessity designed to keep me subordinate. They needed me to fail, or at least remain quiet in the background, so the narrative of Ashley's perfection could remain unchallenged. I blinked, bringing my focus back to the polished mahogany of the bar. I traced the rim of the club soda glass once more. The bitter memory faded, replaced by the steady, comforting hum of the oaken gavel. I was no longer the exhausted law student shrinking away from the kitchen table. I was a woman who had just conquered the grueling New York bar exam without a single dime or word of encouragement from the people who raised me. The silence from my mother earlier that afternoon did not break me. It fortified me. It proved that I had built my own foundation brick by brick while they were busy decorating guest rooms. The heavy oak doors at the rear of the pub closed with a solid, echoing thud. Footsteps rang out against the hardwood floor, steady and deliberate, cutting through the low chatter of the room. The figure bypassed the scattered leather booths and headed straight for the bar. I kept my gaze forward, focusing on the amber bottles lined up against the mirrored back wall. The air shifted as the man approached, bringing with him an undeniable gravity that silenced the patrons nearest to us. He took the empty leather stool directly to my left. The bartender, Mac, gave a brief, deeply respectful nod, a silent acknowledgement between men who understood how power operated in this city. The game was about to change. The man who claimed the stool next to mine did not announce his presence with loud greetings or boastful swagger. He moved with the quiet, predatory grace of someone who owned every room he entered. I recognized him instantly from a dozen different legal journals and high-profile court filings. Jonathan Pierce was the legendary managing partner at Pierce & Caldwell. His firm was known across Manhattan as a ruthless corporate powerhouse, a place where associate attorneys either burned out within a single year or forged themselves into elite litigators. Pierce wore a bespoke charcoal suit that draped flawlessly over his frame. Silver traced his temples. His eyes were the color of slate, betraying a formidable intellect and a distinct lack of patience for mediocrity. Mac did not ask for his order. The bartender simply poured 2 fingers of amber liquid into a crystal tumbler and slid it across the mahogany surface. Pierce picked up the glass. He took a slow, deliberate sip. He did not look at me right away. He stared straight ahead at the rows of bottles reflecting the dim tavern lighting. "Mac tells me you just slayed the dragon," Pierce said. His voice was a resonant baritone, smooth and commanding. "He also mentioned your cavalry failed to arrive for the victory parade. He says you have a certain kind of hunger." I turned my head to face him. I kept my expression guarded, refusing to shrink under his intense presence. "Mac is very observant." Pierce set his tumbler down. He turned his slate eyes toward me. He did not offer congratulations. He did not offer a sympathetic smile regarding my absent family. Pity had no currency in his world, and I did not want it anyway. Instead, he reached into the inner breast pocket of his suit jacket and extracted a heavy, gold-trimmed fountain pen. He reached across the bar and pulled a flimsy paper cocktail napkin from the small stack resting between our glasses. He smoothed the thin, white square flat against the damp wood of the counter. The sharp scratch of his fountain pen on the cheap paper cut through the ambient hum of the pub. The sound was oddly jarring. It highlighted a stark contrast between the high-stakes complexities of corporate law and the casual, dim reality of a neighborhood dive bar. Pierce began sketching a labyrinthine corporate structure. He drew intersecting boxes, sweeping arrows, and jagged lines connecting a web of hypothetical business entities. He worked with practiced speed, his hand moving in fluid, precise strokes that left thick trails of dark ink. "Let us evaluate this hunger," Pierce stated, his tone shifting into the cadence of a courtroom interrogator. "You are representing a domestic holding company, acquiring a distressed manufacturing asset. The target entity has a labyrinth of offshore subsidiaries holding various valuable intellectual property rights. The parent company wants to execute a triangular merger to shield itself from a wave of pre-existing environmental litigation." He tapped the gold nib of his pen against a specific box on the napkin, leaving a small bloom of dark blue ink on the porous surface. "However," Pierce continued, his voice dropping into a low, challenging register, "these offshore entities carry unresolved tax liabilities in two different foreign jurisdictions. The acquiring parent intends to dissolve the target subsidiary immediately post-closing to streamline global operations and maximize shareholder value. Tell me the primary exposure here. You have 2 minutes." He clicked the cap back onto his pen and rested his hands on the edge of the bar, waiting. I stared down at the blue ink bleeding slowly into the white napkin fibers. A lesser attorney might have crumbled under the sudden, intense scrutiny of a legal titan. They might have stammered, intimidated by the impromptu interrogation and the impossible time limit. I did not panic. Panic was a luxury reserved for people who had a safety net to catch them when they plummeted. I had grown up in a household where my very existence was treated as a logistical error, a minor nuisance to be managed. To survive the Lawrence family ecosystem, I had been forced to develop a hyper-vigilant attention to detail. Whenever my mother changed the rules of engagement to favor my sister, I had to analyze the shifting landscape and adapt instantly just to avoid punishment and secure basic resources. I had spent 25 years anticipating emotional traps designed by the exact people who were supposed to protect me. This scenario drawn on a cocktail napkin was not a trap meant to humiliate me. This was an invitation to prove my worth. For the first time in my entire life, a figure of authority was not judging me based on my utility to a golden child. Jonathan Pierce did not care about destination weddings, expensive wallpaper, or my sister's social calendar. He cared entirely about merit, sharp intellect, and flawless execution. The asymmetry of worth that had defined my childhood was dissolving right in front of my eyes. I was being evaluated on a pure, unadulterated metric of competence. It was the most liberating sensation I had ever experienced. I leaned forward, focusing my vision solely on the diagram. My mind began to sift through thousands of hours of solitary library research, pulling case law and statutory language with clinical efficiency. I identified the hidden snare within 15 seconds. I took a steady breath, letting the cool pub air fill my lungs and anchor my focus. "The offshore tax liabilities are a deliberate diversion," I said, my voice steady and clear, cutting through the background noise of the bar. "They present a logistical headache, but they are entirely manageable through standard indemnification clauses and aggressive escrow holdbacks. The real trap is the post-closing dissolution strategy." Pierce did not move a single muscle. He kept his slate eyes fixed firmly on my face, offering no physical confirmation or denial of my theory. "By immediately dissolving the target subsidiary after completing a triangular merger." I continued, tracing my index finger over the arrow pointing upward to the parent company. "You invoke the de facto merger doctrine. The parent company is blatantly attempting to absorb the profitable assets while discarding the toxic liabilities. New York courts view this specific maneuver with extreme prejudice. If the acquiring company continues the same manufacturing operations, retains the exact same executive management, and utilizes the same physical assets, the corporate veil will not hold." I looked up, meeting his imposing gaze directly. "If they dissolve that entity, the parent company assumes full successor liability for the pending environmental litigation. The plaintiffs will pierce the corporate veil effortlessly. Those foreign tax issues will become the least of their worries when a federal judge freezes their domestic operating accounts to satisfy a nine-figure environmental judgment. You must stop the dissolution. You keep the subsidiary alive and adequately capitalized, ring-fencing the toxic assets, or you advise your client to walk away from the deal entirely. To reinforce my analysis, I pulled the specific appellate precedent from my memory. Schumacher versus Richards Shear Company established the strict parameters for successor liability in this jurisdiction. The appellate division reaffirmed that exact standard late last year. The structure you drew is a fatal error. The pub seemed to grow noticeably quieter around us. The clinking of glasses and the low murmur of nearby conversations faded into a distant hum. I sat perfectly still, waiting for his verdict. I had presented my case. I had dismantled his complex scenario without a shred of hesitation. Pierce stared at the ruined napkin for a long, silent moment. He reached out and slowly rotated the paper square, examining the ink boxes as if seeing them for the very first time. The hard, unforgiving lines around his mouth relaxed into an expression of genuine clinical approval. He recognized the forged in fire competence radiating from my answer. He saw someone who had earned every single inch of her ground through relentless solitary warfare. He saw a young attorney who did not rely on wealthy pedigree or superficial charm, but on a razor-sharp intellect honed by sheer necessity. Most junior associates from Ivy League programs, Pierce noted softly, his tone laced with a hint of dark amusement, would have spent their entire 2 minutes spinning their wheels on foreign tax treaties. They would have missed the domestic landmine entirely. He picked up his crystal tumbler and took another measured sip of his scotch. He did not smile, but the atmosphere between us had irrevocably changed. The test was over. I had proven that I belonged in a room where intellect was the only currency that mattered. Pierce reached inside his tailored jacket and produced a thick cream-colored square of cardstock. He placed it flat on the mahogany counter and pushed it toward me with a single finger. The card felt heavy, textured with embossed gold lettering that caught the dim tavern light. The name Jonathan Pierce sat above the title Managing Partner. My junior associates bill 80 hours a week. Pierce stated, his tone shifting from intellectual curiosity to rigid professionalism. They do not leave the office until the partners leave. They do not complain, and they do not make rudimentary errors. In exchange, they receive a starting salary of $215,000 a year plus performance bonuses. I kept my expression neutral, though my pulse hammered against my ribs. The figure he just casually quoted eclipsed my parents' combined retirement savings. It was a sum of money that altered trajectories. "Be at the firm on Monday at 7 in the morning," Pierce commanded, rising from his stool and buttoning his jacket in one fluid motion. "Ask for my executive assistant. She will have your onboarding packet ready. Do not be late, Diana." He walked away before I could offer a response, his expensive leather shoes echoing faintly as he exited the pub. I sat in the quiet aftermath, staring at the embossed card. I had entered the Oaken Gavel as a discarded daughter seeking a quiet place to drink a soda. I was leaving as an incoming attorney at one of the most formidable corporate law firms in Manhattan. The evening air felt sharper when I finally stepped back onto the pavement. The city lights smeared across the damp asphalt, illuminating the path toward the subway. I rode the train back to Astoria, the rhythmic clatter of the tracks mirroring the frantic racing of my thoughts. I walked the 4 blocks from the station to my building, clutching my thin coat against the autumn wind. My studio apartment occupied the 4th floor of a pre-war walk-up. The space was claustrophobic, measuring barely 400 square feet. A leaky radiator hissed in the corner, battling the draft that seeped through a poorly sealed window. A narrow twin bed sat pushed against the far wall, flanked by milk crates stuffed with heavy legal textbooks. It was a meager existence funded by grueling diner shifts and strict budgeting. I placed the gold-lettered business card squarely on the center of my small laminate kitchen table. It looked like an artifact from an alien civilization dropped into my modest reality. I set my phone next to it. The screen remained dark. Saturday morning arrived with overcast skies and a quiet that felt heavy. I woke up early, my body conditioned to the punishing schedule of law school. I reached for my device, tapping the glass to wake it. No new notifications. No missed calls. No texts. The absence of communication was a familiar specter. I navigated to my messages app, staring at the thread with my mother. The last outgoing text was a brief response from me confirming I would wait until next weekend to celebrate passing the bar exam. She had read it. She had simply chosen not to reply. My father had not reached out at all. I imagined their weekend unfolding across the river in their immaculate suburban home. Carol and my father were likely driving to the Hamptons, with Ashley debating paint swatches and crown molding, entirely consumed by the trivial details of my sister's aesthetic preferences. In the past, this silent treatment would have triggered a spiral of anxiety. The designated scapegoat is conditioned to chase approval, to interpret neglect as a personal failing that must be corrected through harder work and quiet submission. I used to manufacture excuses for them. I would tell myself they were just busy or distracted, or that my accomplishments were inherently less interesting than Ashley's vibrant social life. I would shrink myself, hoping that if I demanded nothing, they might eventually offer a crumb of validation. As the hours crept by, the Saturday afternoon sun casting long pale shadows across my linoleum floor, the phone remained stubbornly silent. I watched the digital clock on the stove tick forward. By Saturday evening, the lack of acknowledgement morphed into a tangible entity in the room. They had let the most important milestone of my life pass without a single gesture of pride. I did not cry. The tears I had shed during my teenage years had long since dried up, replaced by a hardened, analytical detachment. I sat on the edge of my narrow bed and analyzed the data presented to me. The silence was not a mere oversight. It was a clear, unmistakable declaration of my value within the Lawrence family economy. When Sunday morning dawned, 48 hours had elapsed since I received my results. The phone was still devoid of family contact. A profound shift occurred in my chest. The suffocating weight of expectation dissolved. For 25 years, I had viewed their neglect as a punishment, a persistent reminder that I was insufficient. Now, staring at the blank screen, I saw it for what it truly was. It was permission. If they did not care enough to acknowledge my triumph, they forfeited any claim to my future. I was no longer required to wait for a validation that would never arrive. The psychological tether snapped. The scapegoat daughter died in that cramped Queen's studio, and the Manhattan attorney took her place. I spent Sunday afternoon meticulously preparing for the battle ahead. I did not possess a closet full of designer garments. My professional wardrobe consisted of items painstakingly sourced from local thrift stores and discount racks. I dragged a rickety ironing board out from under my bed, setting it up in the narrow space between the radiator and the kitchen counter. I laid out a charcoal gray blazer I had purchased for $12. The fabric was slightly worn at the elbows, but the cut was professional. I filled a cheap plastic iron with tap water and plugged it in. The appliance hissed, releasing puffs of steam into the chilly apartment air. I pressed the hot metal against the collar, smoothing out every wrinkle with deliberate, focused precision. My phone sat face down on the opposite end of the counter. It was a silent block of glass and metal, stripped of its power to cause me pain. I did not check it. I did not care if they ever called again. While the iron glided over the inexpensive fabric, I reviewed a stack of printed documents. I had spent the earlier part of the day at the public library pulling recent public filings and appellate briefs handled by Pierce and Caldwell. I studied their litigation strategies, memorizing the names of key partners and major corporate clients. I analyzed their ruthless tactics in hostile takeovers and complex asset restructuring. I was mapping the terrain of my new battlefield. I hung the pressed blazer on a wire hanger, hooking it over the bathroom door frame. I polished a pair of sensible black heels until they gleamed. I packed my leather briefcase with fresh legal pads, black pens, and the detailed notes I had compiled on the firm. Every action was a deliberate step away from the shadows of my upbringing. The evening sun dipped below the city skyline, casting the apartment into dusk. I turned off the iron and let the room cool. I looked at the embossed business card one last time before tucking it securely into my bag. The weekend had begun with a profound sense of isolation, but it concluded with an unshakable clarity. I was walking into the epicenter of the legal world tomorrow morning, and I was going to conquer it alone. The quiet weekend had forged my armor. I set my alarm for 4:30 in the morning, ready to face the grueling demands of a managing partner who saw exactly what I was capable of. The transition from an ignored daughter in Queens to a formidable corporate litigator took exactly 8 months. Pierce and Caldwell demanded 80-hour work weeks as a baseline, a punishing schedule that shattered most junior hires by their third month. I watched Ivy League graduates weep in the mahogany-paneled restrooms, crushed beneath the weight of partner expectations and impossible deadlines. I never shed a single tear. The senior attorneys yelled, criticized, and demanded perfection, but their ire was strictly professional. To someone raised in the Lawrence household where emotional starvation was deployed as a daily psychological weapon, corporate pressure felt like a gentle breeze. I had spent 2 decades anticipating the erratic moods of my parents and catering to my sister's manufactured crises. Compared to navigating my family's toxic ecosystem, parsing complex financial regulations was a sanctuary. My emotional detachment became my greatest asset. I absorbed criticism without flinching, executed directives with clinical precision, and treated every legal obstacle as a mathematical equation to be solved. Jonathan Pierce noticed. He recognized that I possessed no safety net, no trust fund to fall back on, and no family waiting to celebrate my weekends. He saw a weapon he could sharpen. Instead of burying me in endless discovery reviews for low-level disputes, he pulled me directly into his inner circle. He assigned me to a high-stakes financial fraud and asset recovery task force. Our client was a premier investment bank headquartered just blocks away, bleeding capital after a series of staggering commercial loan defaults. A sophisticated network of shell companies had secured 9-figure funding for luxury real estate developments, diverted the capital through offshore accounts, and subsequently declared bankruptcy. The developers vanished, leaving the bank holding worthless collateral. Pierce tasked me with tracing the phantom funds. It was a Tuesday in early June, approaching 2 in the morning. The 40th floor was a silent expanse of glass and steel suspended high above the sleeping city. Most of the firm had emptied out hours ago, leaving only a skeletal crew of night staff and a handful of senior associates trapped in windowless conference rooms. I sat at my desk, surrounded by towering stacks of printed bank records, loan applications, and corporate registry filings. The thrifted blazer I wore to the dive bar was long gone, replaced by a tailored charcoal wool suit that armor-plated my posture. The overhead fluorescent lights hummed quietly, casting a sterile, blue-tinged glow over my workspace. The air conditioning whispered through the vents, keeping the temperature cool and unforgiving. My eyes burned from staring at dual monitors for 18 consecutive hours, but I refused to stop. I was tracking a specific wire transfer. $12 million had moved from a domestic holding company into a Delaware-registered entity, ostensibly to purchase construction materials for a luxury condominium project in Miami. Instead of reaching suppliers, the funds splintered into 40 smaller transactions, routing through accounts in the Cayman Islands, Cyprus, and Switzerland. I cross-referenced the dates matching the outgoing transfers to the exact days the original loans were issued. It was a classic embezzlement layering technique designed to obscure the origin of the capital before integrating it back into the domestic economy as clean money. I needed the names behind the Delaware entity. The registered agent was a generic corporate services firm in Wilmington, a standard buffer used to hide true ownership. I dug deeper, accessing the firm's proprietary investigative databases to pull the original incorporation documents filed 3 years prior. The PDF loaded slowly on my right monitor, line after line of boilerplate legal jargon scrolling past my tired eyes. I reached the signature page, searching for the authorized managing member who had executed the formation. My breath caught in my throat. My hand holding a yellow highlighter froze mid-air above a printed spreadsheet. The name typed beneath the authorization line was Bradley Hayes. I blinked hard, forcing my eyes to refocus, assuming exhaustion was playing tricks on my vision. I stared at the screen. The name remained unchanged. I quickly typed the entity name into a secondary database, pulling the corresponding property deeds and securing agreements tied to the defaulted loans. Every single document traced back to Bradley. This was not a coincidence. This was my sister's husband. This was the golden son-in-law, the man my parents worshipped for his expensive suits, his leased sports cars, and his grand sweeping promises about revolutionizing the real estate market. During Thanksgiving dinners I had catered for free, he used to boast loudly about his complex corporate structures and his genius tax strategies. My parents had nodded along in awe, treating every word he spoke like gospel while simultaneously berating me for lacking ambition. Now staring at the cold, hard evidence on my monitor, the facade shattered. Bradley was not a brilliant real estate developer. He was a common fraudster running a Ponzi scheme built on forged documents and stolen institutional capital. The lavish Hamptons guest suite, the designer wallpaper my mother had prioritized over my bar exam results, the private school tuitions for his children, all of it was funded by embezzled money. He was the architect of the exact fraudulent network Jonathan Pierce had hired me to dismantle. I zoomed in on the scanned promissory note displayed on my screen. The fluorescent lights overhead continued their steady, quiet hum. I picked up my yellow highlighter, the neon ink glowing brightly against the stark white paper of a printed copy I had just pulled from the physical file. I dragged the marker across the blue ink signature at the bottom of the page, highlighting the familiar loop of Bradley's cursive handwriting. The scratch of the felt tip against the paper sounded deafening in the empty office. My professional and personal worlds had just collided with catastrophic force. For nearly a year, I had maintained total silence, executing a clean break from the people who had treated me like a disposable commodity. I had built a fortress around my new life, isolating myself from their toxic hierarchy. Yet here, buried in the depths of a high-stakes corporate investigation, my family had somehow found their way back onto my desk. I leaned back in my ergonomic chair, the leather creaking slightly under my shifting weight. My heart rate remained remarkably steady. A lesser associate might have panicked, terrified by the sudden ethical dilemma of investigating a relative. They might have immediately called a partner to recuse themselves, fearful of the impending fallout and desperate to avoid conflict. I felt no fear. I felt a profound, chilling clarity. The universe had not just handed me a complex legal puzzle. It had handed me the ledger containing every debt my family owed. I did not reach for my phone to call my sister. I did not draft an urgent email to Pierce. I sat in the quiet hum of the law firm and systematically began printing every single document bearing Bradley's name. I organized the offshore transfer logs, the falsified asset declarations, and the fraudulent loan applications into a neat categorized pile. I was gathering the ammunition piece by piece, documenting the exact parameters of his crimes. The man they had chosen to invest all their pride and adoration into was facing federal prison, and I was the associate holding the key to his cell. I stacked the final printed page onto the growing pile. I tapped the edges against the mahogany desk until the sheets aligned perfectly. The silence of my phone over the past 8 months had been their choice. The incoming storm was going to be mine. The following Thursday brought a steady, unrelenting rain that battered the thick glass of my corner office. I sat behind my desk reviewing a series of asset forfeiture protocols. The quiet hum of the climate control system provided a steady background noise to my focused routine. I had spent the past week organizing the offshore evidence, building an inescapable perimeter around the target of our investigation. My personal cell phone vibrated against the polished mahogany surface. The screen illuminated, displaying a number I had not seen active in nearly a year. I stared at the 10 digits. My mother was calling. The timing was poetic. 365 days of profound silence had elapsed since I passed the bar exam. She had spent an entire year ignoring my existence, prioritizing guest room renovations and country club social calendars over her youngest daughter. Now, right as the federal net began to tighten around her prized son-in-law, my phone was ringing. I picked up the device. I did not feel a sudden spike in my heart rate. I swiped my thumb across the glass and lifted the phone to my ear. "Hello," I said, my voice steady and professional. "Dee Dee, is that you, sweetheart?" The sound of the childhood nickname struck my ear like a discordant note. Dee Dee. It was a moniker designed to sound small, fragile, and compliant. Carol had not called me that name since I was in high school. Bringing it back now was a calculated tactical maneuver. She was attempting to instantly bridge a year of total abandonment, projecting an unearned familiarity to soften the ground for whatever request she was about to make. She wanted to transport me back to a time when I was desperate for her approval. "It is Diana," I corrected her, keeping my tone smooth and devoid of irritation. "Of course it is, honey," Carol replied, her voice dripping with a sickly sweet cadence that felt thick and manufactured. "I am just so happy to hear your voice. It feels like forever since we caught up. How have you been? I heard through the grapevine that you landed a position at a very prestigious Manhattan law firm. Pierce and Caldwell, right? Your father and I are just glowing with pride." The sheer audacity of her statement hung in the air. She was claiming pride for an achievement she had actively dismissed. She had heard about my employment through neighborhood gossip, not because she had ever bothered to ask. I leaned back in my leather chair and let her speak. I knew the rules of her conversational games. The flattery was merely the appetizer. The main course was coming. "I am doing well, Mom," I said. "What is the purpose of your call?" Carol let out a light, breathy laugh, attempting to wave away the directness of my question. "Well, I can't just call to check on my successful daughter, but since you mention it, there is a tiny family matter that has popped up. Nothing serious, just a little bureaucratic headache. I thought maybe you could offer some quick advice." "Go on," I instructed. Carol cleared her throat, shifting into a hushed, conspiratorial tone. "It is about Bradley. You know how complicated the real estate development business can be. He works so hard to provide that beautiful life for Ashley and the kids. Recently, he ran into a tiny misunderstanding with some of his institutional lenders. It is all a big paperwork mix-up, really. But you know how these large financial banks operate. They are being incredibly unreasonable, sending threatening letters and freezing some of his operating capital over a simple clerical error." I looked at the printed spreadsheet sitting on my desk, the one detailing $12 million of stolen capital routed through the Cayman Islands. A clerical error. The delusion she operated under was staggering. She truly believed her golden son-in-law was merely a victim of hostile banking policies. "That sounds stressful." I offered, giving her nothing but a neutral reflection of her own words. "It is exhausting." Carol sighed, leaning into her manufactured victimhood. "Ashley is beside herself with worry. The stress is ruining her health. That is why I thought of you. You work at one of those big, powerful firms in the city. You understand how these ruthless creditors think. We need you to step in and make this go away." I remained silent, letting the magnitude of her request settle over the phone line. After erasing my legal education and treating my ambition as a nuisance, she now wished to exploit my credentials to shield her favored child. "I am sure you can just review his files." Carol continued, her pace quickening as she laid out her demands. "You can represent him informally or pull some strings with the senior partners at your office. Draft a few stern letters on that fancy firm letterhead and tell these banks to back off. We need to protect the family reputation, Diana. A scandal like this would be devastating for your sister." She was weaponizing the concept of family loyalty, twisting it into a blunt instrument to extract free labor and legal protection. In her mind, my entire career existed solely to serve as a convenient tool for their emergencies. She expected me to risk my ethical standing, my license to practice law, and my professional future to clean up a mess created by a man who treated me with open disdain. She sought to drag me right back into the servitude I had spent years escaping. I listened to her frantic, manipulative requests without interrupting. I did not raise my voice. I did not point out the hypocrisy of her sudden interest in my career. I did not mention that the hostile creditors she was complaining about were my direct clients, or that the stern letters she wanted me to draft were actually federal subpoenas I had already filed. Emotional manipulation relies on eliciting a reaction. Carol wanted me to argue to seek her validation, to jump at the opportunity to finally prove my worth by saving the family. By remaining perfectly still, I denied her the emotional fuel she needed to power her engine. Family helps family, Diana. Carol urged, her voice adopting a pleading, desperate edge when my silence stretched too long. We really need you to step up here. You are the smart one. You know how to handle these suits. I looked out the window at the Manhattan skyline, a sprawling grid of glass and steel built on ruthless merit and unforgiving consequences. My mother thought she was summoning a compliant, desperate daughter to act as her shield. She had no idea she was actively inviting the prosecution to her dinner table. I understand the severity of the situation, I said calmly. It sounds very complicated. I can't promise anything over the phone without looking at the details. Of course, Carol agreed, eagerly sensing a victory. We should meet in person. Your father and Ashley want to see you too. Bradley will bring all his paperwork. We can take you out to a nice dinner in the city and review the situation together. Just tell us when you are free. I opened my digital calendar, noting my upcoming strategy meetings with Jonathan Pierce. I selected a date that would give me enough time to finalize the asset seizure warrants. Next Tuesday evening, I replied. I will send you the name of a restaurant in Midtown. We can review everything then. Thank you, Dee Dee, Carol cooed, her relief palpable. I knew we could count on you. I love you. I will see you on Tuesday, I said, and ended the call. I set the phone down on the mahogany desk. I did not feel a shred of guilt or hesitation. The trap was set, requested, and orchestrated by the very people who were about to walk into it. I picked up my pen and returned to my asset forfeiture protocols, my focus sharper than ever. I placed the receiver back onto its cradle, letting the plastic settle into place. The sound was definitive in the quiet space of my office. My mother believed she had just secured free legal protection, assuming the old rules of our household still applied. I did not linger on the insult. I picked up my legal pad, smoothed the lapels of my blazer, and walked out of my glass enclosure. The corridor of Pierce & Caldwell stretched before me, lined with rich mahogany panels and modern art that whispered silent wealth. I walked straight toward the corner office belonging to Jonathan Pierce. Pierce sat behind a desk carved from a single slab of reclaimed walnut. He was a man who built his empire by exploiting the weaknesses of opposing counsel and demanding flawless ethical rigor from his own team. When I entered, he did not look up from the deposition transcript he was annotating. I stood before him, waiting until he finished his thought and capped his silver fountain pen. I delivered the information with factual sterility. I informed him that the primary target of our asset recovery investigation, Bradley Hayes, was my brother-in-law. I cited the specific ethical compliance statutes regarding conflicts of interest under the New York Rules of Professional Conduct. I laid my resignation from the task force on the desk, offering to transfer my findings and my meticulous evidence logs to another associate immediately. I explained that any perception of familial bias could jeopardize the integrity of the prosecution. Pierce stared at me. His slate-gray eyes searched my face, looking for hesitation, for lingering familial sentiment, for a shred of weakness. He found none. A slow, chilling smile touched the corners of his mouth. He understood the dynamics of power and leverage better than anyone in Manhattan. He saw that I possessed zero loyalty to the man who stole from our client. He recognized that my unique position was not a liability, but an unprecedented tactical advantage. I knew Bradley. I knew his arrogance, his habits, his desperate need to project wealth and success to secure validation. Pierce did not dismiss me from the team. Instead, he authorized me to remain the lead associate. He told me to use my insider knowledge to construct an inescapable prosecution. He instructed me to dismantle the man who had defrauded their client, and to do so with surgical precision. I returned to my desk. The next 72 hours became a grueling marathon of financial forensics and legal strategy. I locked my office door, requesting meals be delivered directly to my workspace. I pulled the raw wire transfer logs, the routing numbers, and the corporate registry filings from a dozen different international jurisdictions. My childhood had trained me to be invisible to observe the shifting dynamics of power without drawing attention. I applied that same silent vigilance to tracing Bradley's financial labyrinth. I traced the capital flight path through the secure banking network, matching the dates of the initial disbursements to the exact moments the offshore entities were incorporated. Bradley had used classic layering techniques, breaking large sums into smaller transactions to avoid triggering automated compliance alerts. He was sloppy, leaving digital footprints across multiple time zones. I spent hours dissecting the false ledger entries he used to justify the outgoing wires. The work was exhausting, but it fueled a deep, relentless energy inside me. For years, I had been forced to decipher the unspoken rules of my family, walking on eggshells to avoid my mother's disapproval or my father's disdain. Now I was applying those same analytical survival skills to unravel a criminal enterprise. I needed a physical repository for the evidence, something tangible to anchor the abstract numbers floating across my dual monitors. I walked to the supply room and selected a pristine navy blue legal binder. I sat at my desk, organizing the bank statements with careful deliberation. The sharp click of the heavy metal hole puncher echoed in the quiet room as I drove the steel cylinders through thick stacks of printed evidence. Click, a shell company registered in the Cayman Islands. Click, a phantom vendor invoice routed through a Cypriot bank. Click, the offshore accounts where Bradley had funneled the embezzled capital, washing the funds before converting them into untraceable luxury assets. I filed each page into the binder, snapping the silver rings shut with finality. As I dug deeper into the original loan application, searching for the initial point of structural failure, I began to unravel the core of the fraud. Bradley had required substantial domestic assets to secure the early mezzanine financing before he could siphon the funds offshore. The investment bank had demanded guarantors with flawless credit and tangible equity. I pulled the notarized signature pages from the digital archives. The scanned images loaded slowly onto my right monitor. I stopped breathing for a fraction of a second. There, at the bottom of a commercial promissory note pledging unencumbered assets against a high-risk construction loan, was my mother's looping decorative cursive. Right beside it rested my father's rigid, blocky print. The handwriting was unmistakable. It was the same cursive my mother used to write glowing praise inside Ashley's birthday cards, the same rigid print my father used to sign the checks for my sister's private tutoring. I pulled the secondary documents to verify the collateral schedules. They had not merely vouched for his character. They had legally co-signed 2 of the fraudulent loans. They had pledged the deed to their suburban home and the entirety of their mutual fund retirement portfolios as backing for the credit line. They had tied their entire financial existence, everything they valued and prioritized over my future, to Bradley's sinking ship. I stared at the glowing screen, processing the magnitude of their error. A lesser attorney might have felt a surge of panic for their parents. A devoted daughter might have reached for the telephone to warn them of the impending ruin, begging them to seek independent counsel. I felt neither. I sat in the cold blue light of my office and experienced a profound, terrifying calm. The clinical detachment of a seasoned prosecutor settled over my shoulders like a heavy mantle. My parents had co-signed those loans because they believed Bradley was the genius they always wanted me to be. They had funded his illusion using their own security, blinded by his flashy suits and empty promises. I printed the signature pages. I aligned the edges perfectly, tapping the paper against the mahogany wood of my desk. I placed them into the heavy metal device. The sharp click of the hole puncher sounded loud and rhythmic. I placed the final pages into the navy blue binder. I closed the cover. The weapon was built. It contained no emotion, no resentment, and no tears. It contained only indisputable financial data, routing numbers, and legally binding signatures that tied my parents to a federal crime. My family thought they had summoned a helpless daughter to fix their mistake. They believed they could use my legal expertise to sweep a major financial crime under the rug and protect their pristine suburban reputation. They were planning a dinner to exert their familiar authority, expecting me to fall into the role of the compliant, invisible spare child. They did not understand that the girl they used to command no longer existed. They had summoned their prosecutor. I checked my calendar for the upcoming meeting time. I placed the heavy binder into my leather briefcase, snapping the brass locks shut. The trap was fully primed. The revolving doors of the Midtown Steakhouse ushered me into an environment explicitly engineered to broadcast wealth and influence. The air inside the restaurant carried the rich, heavy scent of seared prime beef, roasted garlic, and aged oak. Brass fixtures gleamed under low amber lighting, illuminating the dark mahogany-paneled walls. Waiters in crisp white jackets glided seamlessly across the thick carpeted floor, balancing heavy silver trays holding expensive bottles of vintage wine. This was a venue favored by investment bankers, senior partners, and hedge fund managers, celebrating closed deals. My parents had chosen this specific restaurant to project authority and to play on what they assumed was my new turf. They wanted to intimidate me with their willingness to navigate my corporate world, projecting a facade of financial stability that I knew for a fact they no longer possessed. I spotted them immediately at a large circular leather booth situated near the center of the bustling dining room. They had not come alone. It was not just a quiet dinner with my mother and father. The entire family tribunal had assembled to stage an intervention. Carol sat at the center of the curved booth wearing a stiff silk blouse that signaled she intended to control the evening. My father sat to her left. His jaw was tight as he reviewed a leather-bound menu, his eyes darting across the pages as he clearly calculated the exorbitant cost of the evening. Across from them sat my sister Ashley, clutching a quilted designer handbag in her lap, like a protective shield. Beside Ashley sat Bradley, effectively trapped on the inside of the booth. The golden son-in-law looked nothing like the arrogant real estate mogul who used to hold court at our holiday dinners. During past Thanksgivings, Bradley would lean back in his chair, swirling an expensive glass of bourbon, boasting loudly about his complex corporate structures and mocking my decision to attend a state school. Today, the custom Italian suit he wore seemed to hang loosely on a diminished frame. A sheen of nervous sweat coated his forehead, reflecting the overhead amber light. He kept tapping his thumb against his water glass, a frantic, rhythmic tick that betrayed a deep internal panic. He looked like a man standing on a trap door, waiting for the lever to be pulled. I walked toward the table, my footsteps silent on the thick carpet. I carried my leather briefcase, the navy blue binder resting heavy and secure inside it. When Carol saw my approach, her face stretched into a wide, artificial smile that did not reach her eyes. She stood up slightly, motioning for me to join them, her gestures broad and theatrical. I slid into the empty leather seat opposite my mother. The table was set with heavy crystal goblets, starched white linen napkins, and polished flatware. Right in the center of my place setting, resting directly next to my heavy silver salad fork, lay a piece of standard printer paper. I looked down at the document. It was a generic legal retainer agreement clearly downloaded from a free legal forms website. The font was a basic Times New Roman, and the formatting was uneven, with the URL of the free template site still faintly visible at the bottom corner of the page. Blank lines were scattered throughout the text, waiting to be filled in with a ballpoint pen. There was no firm letterhead, no specific scope of representation, no ethical conflict waiver, and no indemnification clause. It was a template designed for small claims court or a simple neighborhood traffic dispute. Placing that cheap invalid printout next to the pristine restaurant silver highlighted their profound disrespect for my actual expertise. They viewed my grueling legal education, my passing of the bar, and my position at an elite Manhattan corporate firm as nothing more than a convenient tool they could harness with a downloaded form. They believed high-stakes corporate litigation could be initiated by signing a piece of printer paper over appetizers. Before I could even remove my trench coat, Carol launched into her orchestrated narrative. She leaned forward, resting her elbows on the white tablecloth, ensuring her voice carried just enough to be heard by the neighboring tables. She was weaponizing the public setting, relying on the unwritten social contract of polite society to force my compliance. Throughout my childhood, whenever I attempted to assert a boundary, my mother would raise her voice in public, knowing my fear of causing a scene would make me yield instantly. She assumed I would still shrink from a public spectacle. "Diana, sweetheart, we are so glad you could make time for us." Carol began, her tone dripping with manufactured warmth. "We have a bit of a family situation and we need your help. You know how unpredictable the real estate market is right now. Bradley has run into a tiny misunderstanding with some hostile lenders. They are being incredibly unreasonable about some loan timelines and paperwork." Ashley sniffled loudly on cue, dabbing the corner of her eye with a manicured finger. "It is so stressful, Diana. Bradley works so hard to provide for us, and these financial institutions are just bullying him. We did not know who else to turn to." Carol took over again, raising her volume a fraction higher so the businessmen at the next table would glance over. "You are the smart one, Diana. You work at that fancy firm in the city. You know the people there. We need you to step in and fix this quietly. Just sign the paper, make a few calls, draft some letters, and get these banks to back off. It is your duty to help. Family helping family, right?" The phrase hung in the air, a verbal snare designed to trap me in a web of unearned obligation. She looked around the restaurant, offering a tight, suffering smile to a couple dining at the adjacent table. She was inviting strangers to witness her plight as a devoted mother merely trying to save her family from bureaucratic bullying. It was the classic familial trap. They utilized overwhelming numbers, a high-end public venue, and the heavy weight of social pressure to corner their isolated target. I did not look at the generic retainer agreement resting on my plate. I did not look at the neighboring tables or shrink away from the wandering eyes of the other patrons. I kept my gaze locked on my mother, my expression a mask of clinical detachment. I absorbed the manipulation without blinking, maintaining unbroken eye contact. I watched the frantic pulse thumping in Bradley's neck. I saw the desperate, grasping entitlement shining in my sister's eyes. I observed my father anxiously checking his watch. They had summoned me to act as their obedient shield, entirely unaware that I had spent the last 3 days meticulously forging the sword that would end them. I treated their performance like a hostile deposition, allowing them to speak freely so they could lock themselves into a false narrative before I presented the undeniable evidence. A waiter approached our booth, a white cloth draped immaculately over his forearm. He held a small leather notepad, oblivious to the suffocating tension radiating from our circular table. He offered a polite smile and asked if we were ready to order our beverages for the evening. I turned my head slowly, breaking the silent standoff with my mother. "I will have a glass of sparkling water with lime," I said, my voice smooth, resonant, and entirely unbothered. I turned back to the tribunal sitting across from me, resting my hands lightly on the pristine white tablecloth. I settled into my seat, perfectly content to let them continue digging their own graves. The waiter retreated, leaving a chilled glass of sparkling water near my right hand. The condensation formed small trails down the curved glass, gathering on the thick cardboard coaster. Across the circular booth, the expectant silence stretched, growing heavy and suffocating. My mother kept her eyes fixed on my hands, waiting for me to reach for the cheap ballpoint pen she had placed beside the printed retainer agreement. She assumed my lack of immediate compliance was merely a temporary hesitation, a momentary lapse in my ingrained obedience. I did not touch the pen. I kept my hands folded, resting on my lap, my posture straight, my expression unreadable. My father leaned forward. His patience, always a shallow reservoir when it came to my boundaries, evaporated. His face darkened, a familiar flush of irritation creeping up his neck. This was his historical pattern. Whenever my mother's honeyed guilt trips failed to produce instant results, my father would step in to provide the brute verbal force browbeating me into submission. He viewed my independence as a personal affront, an act of rebellion against the hierarchy he endorsed. "Pick up the pen, Diana," he ordered. His voice dropped an octave, adopting the harsh, commanding register he used to discipline me when I was a teenager. Stop acting difficult. Your brother-in-law needs legal representation and you are going to provide it. I looked at him. I am not acting difficult. I am declining a request. His jaw clenched. The muscles flickered beneath his skin. This is not a request. We are your family. You owe us. We put a roof over your head, we fed you, we raised you. You do not get to turn your back on us the second you get a little taste of success. The irony of his statement hung in the air, bitter and pronounced. He claimed ownership of my success, demanding a return on an investment he never actually made. He ignored the reality that I had funded my own education, worked grueling night shifts, and navigated the brutal demands of law school entirely alone. He was trying to collect a debt that did not exist. You have a fancy title now, he continued, his tone dripping with condescension, attempting to shrink my world to fit his narrative. But at the end of the day, that firm is just a job. They will replace you tomorrow if you drop dead. We are your blood. Family is forever. You owe this family your loyalty. He pointed a thick finger at the center of the table, tapping the tablecloth to punctuate his demand. He wanted to reduce my career to a trivial hobby, a minor obligation that should easily be tossed aside to serve Bradley's needs. He believed that minimizing my accomplishments would make me desperate to prove my worth to him. When I did not wither under his scolding, Ashley shifted her tactics. Recognizing that brute force was failing, she deployed her preferred weapon. She leaned into the table, her face twisting into an expression of profound manufactured anguish. "How can you be so cold?" Ashley asked, her voice trembling with practiced fragility. "Diana, we are talking about my life, my future." She reached for her starched white linen napkin, pressing it delicately against the corner of her eye. She sniffled a soft, pathetic sound designed to elicit instant sympathy. But I sat close enough to see the performance fracture. As she dabbed at her perfectly dry eyes, careful not to smudge her expensive mascara, she subtly angled her head downward. She caught her reflection in the polished silver blade of the butter knife resting beside her bread plate. She adjusted her expression, checking to ensure her face looked appropriately devastated before looking back up at me. "If the banks freeze our accounts, we could lose everything," Ashley whimpered, clutching Bradley's arm. "We might lose the Hamptons house. Do you have any idea how humiliating that would be? The kids have their summer programs out there. You are my sister. How can you sit there and watch us lose our home when you have the power to stop it?" Her tears were dry, but her panic regarding her social standing was genuine. She did not care about the legal ramifications of Bradley's actions. She did not care about the ethical boundaries I would have to cross, or the career suicide I would commit by representing him. She only cared about maintaining her facade of wealth. She was asking me to sacrifice my entire professional existence so she could keep her vacation home. Bradley sat rigid beside her, refusing to meet my gaze. He stared down at his empty plate, sweating profusely in his custom suit. He knew the truth about his finances, and he knew that my sister's superficial pleas were built on a foundation of stolen money. My continued silence unsettled them. The predictable rhythms of our family dynamics were failing. I was not apologizing. I was not scrambling to reassure them. I was not absorbing their panic and translating it into my own frantic action. I just watched them. Carol recognized the shift. She saw her husband's aggression and her golden daughter's victimhood bouncing off me like water against a stone wall. She realized she had to deliver the final crushing blow. She straightened her spine, pulling her shoulders back to project ultimate authority. She leaned across the table, invading my physical space, her eyes narrowing into cold, hard slits. "We are done playing games, Diana," Carol said, her voice dropping the artificial warmth entirely. "You are going to take that document, you are going to sign it, and you are going to protect your sister's husband. Because if you do not—" She let the threat hang in the air for a fraction of a second, ensuring the weight of her words landed with maximum impact. "If you walk away from us now, when we actually need you." Carol delivered the ultimatum, each word measured and lethal. "Don't ever expect to be part of this family again. We will cut you out. No holidays, no phone calls, no connection. You will be entirely on your own." She played her final card. It was the ultimate emotional extortion. She threatened me with the one thing children are biologically programmed to fear. She assumed the prospect of total isolation would shatter my resolve. She expected me to crumble, to weep, to beg for forgiveness, and to frantically sign the cheap printer paper to secure my place within their circle. She did not understand that her threat was hollow. She was threatening me with a reality I had already mastered. I had spent 25 years living in the margins of their affection. I had spent my birthdays alone, my graduations uncelebrated, and my hardest nights studying in a cold apartment without a single text message asking if I was okay. They had already isolated me. They had already abandoned me. They were threatening to take away a relationship that did not actually exist. The silence in the restaurant seemed to amplify the clatter of silverware and the low hum of distant conversations fading into a dull roar. They stared at me, waiting for the inevitable surrender, waiting for the scapegoat to bend the knee. I looked at my father's red face, at my sister's dry eyes, checking her reflection, at Bradley's terrified sweat, and finally, at my mother's cold, calculating stare. I reached out my right hand. I bypassed the ballpoint pen. I bypassed the downloaded retainer agreement. My fingers wrapped around the chilled glass of sparkling water. The condensation was cool against my skin. I lifted the glass to my lips and took a slow, deliberate sip. The carbonation popped lightly on my tongue. I set the glass back down on the cardboard coaster, placing it exactly where it had been before. I did not break eye contact with my mother. I let the silence stretch for another agonizing second, watching the smug certainty in her expression slowly warp into confusion. I reached down to the floor, my hand finding the brass latch of my leather briefcase. The brass latch of my briefcase yielded with a sharp click. I withdrew the navy blue binder. The smooth spine felt cold against my palm. I lifted the heavy volume above the pristine tablecloth. I released my grip. The binder struck the table with a deafening thud. The impact reverberated through the wood, rattling the expensive crystal wine glasses and sloshing dark red liquid perilously close to the rim. My mother jumped in her seat. My father blinked, startled by the sudden intrusion of physical force into their carefully curated social theater. "I cannot represent you, Bradley," I said. My voice remained flat, devoid of anger or empathy, cutting cleanly through the ambient chatter of the restaurant. "It is a severe conflict of interest." I reached forward and flipped the thick cover open. The silver rings gleamed under the amber lighting overhead. I turned past the index to the first tab, pulling out a crisp, printed spreadsheet. I slid the document across the smooth surface, pushing it directly in front of my brother-in-law. Bradley shrank back as if the paper were radiating heat. He knew exactly what the numbers represented. "This is a wire transfer log," I explained, directing my gaze to my parents. "It is dated 14 months ago. It details an outgoing disbursement of $4.2 million from a primary commercial lending account." I extracted a second document, placing it adjacent to the first. "This is the corporate registry filing for a shell company based in the Cayman Islands. If you look at the routing numbers, you will see they match perfectly. The funds intended for domestic construction materials were diverted offshore within 3 hours of receipt." My father leaned forward, squinting at the dense columns of data. He spent his career as a mid-level manager, familiar enough with basic accounting to recognize glaring anomalies. "What is this, Diana? What are you showing us?" "I am showing you the reality of your son-in-law," I replied. Bradley did not encounter a tiny misunderstanding with hostile lenders. Bradley engineered a sophisticated financial fraud. He embezzled millions of dollars from institutional creditors and hid the capital in untraceable foreign accounts. Ashley let out a sharp gasp. Her hand flew to her mouth, the manicured nails pressing tight against her pale cheeks. The performative tears from minutes ago were instantly replaced by stark, genuine terror. The Hamptons house, the designer handbags, the private school tuitions. She suddenly understood the foundation holding her lavish lifestyle together was rotting wood. "That is a lie," Carol hissed, though her tone lacked its usual commanding resonance. She looked at Bradley, waiting for him to unleash righteous indignation to dismiss my claims as the jealous ramblings of a bitter sibling. Bradley said nothing. He stared at the offshore bank statements, his jaw slack, a bead of sweat tracing a slow path down his temple. The silence emanating from his side of the booth was a damning confession. I turned to the next tab, pulling out a colorful prospectus Bradley had used to woo early investors. He presented these development projects as prime real estate ventures. In truth, the land was never purchased. The zoning permits were forged. The architectural blueprints were copied from public municipal records. He used the incoming loan disbursements to pay off early investors, creating the illusion of rapid growth. I paused, letting the legal terminology sink in. It is a textbook Ponzi scheme. The term hung over the table like a physical weight. My parents prided themselves on their respectability. They attended charity galas, hosted neighborhood association meetings, and judged anyone who failed to meet their rigid suburban standards. They had built their entire identity around projecting flawless success. Now they were staring at indisputable proof that their prized acquisition was a common thief. I continued systematically stripping away the facade. I pointed to a specific sequence of transfers. Notice this date. 3 weeks before Ashley purchased her imported luxury sports utility vehicle, $100,000 moved from a Cypriot holding account into a personal domestic checking account belonging to Bradley. The vehicle was bought with stolen money. Ashley physically recoiled from the table. She looked at her husband with wide, horrified eyes. She had dropped out of law school to secure a life of effortless luxury, trusting Bradley to provide the endless stream of capital she required. She never asked questions about his complex deals, ignoring the red flags, because the checks always cleared. Her willful ignorance had just collided with federal evidence. My father picked up the wire transfer log. His hands, usually so steady when pointing fingers at my shortcomings, trembled slightly. He read the numbers, tracing the routing codes. He looked at Bradley, the man he had praised endlessly, while diminishing my grueling legal education. "Brad," my father croaked, his voice cracking. "Tell me she fabricated this. Tell me this is some legal trick." Bradley swallowed hard. His chest heaved with shallow breaths. He refused to look at my father, keeping his eyes glued to the half-eaten steak on his plate. His silence decimated the remaining shreds of their denial. Carol changed her expression from pale shock to a mottled, furious red. The psychological architecture she had relied upon for decades was crumbling. She had categorized me as the failed investment, the stubborn daughter who chose difficult paths out of sheer defiance. She had elevated Ashley and Bradley to the pinnacle of her social hierarchy. Acknowledging the documents on the table meant acknowledging that her judgment was fundamentally flawed. Her golden child was married to a criminal. The daughter she discarded was the only one dealing in reality. Emotional manipulation requires a willing participant. It requires a victim who values the relationship enough to accept a distorted version of the truth. My mother tried to deploy her usual tactics. She tried to make me feel guilty for bringing this darkness into their lives. She attempted to reframe the narrative, suggesting that if Bradley had made mistakes, it was my familial duty to protect him from the consequences. Her tactics shattered against the impenetrable wall of hard financial data. "You cannot guilt-trip a bank statement, Mom," I said, anticipating her pivot. "You cannot gaslight a wire transfer. The money is gone. The lenders are calling in their notes. The federal authorities are already auditing the shell companies. The illusion is over." I gathered the initial pages and placed them back into the binder. I did not raise my voice, nor did I display any triumphant glee. The clinical detachment of a seasoned prosecutor shielded me from their chaotic despair. I was merely presenting facts to a jury. Bradley finally found his voice. It was a weak, reedy sound, devoid of his usual arrogance. "If you know all this, Diana," he stammered, wiping his forehead with a linen napkin. "If you have all these files, why are you showing us you can stop it? You can bury this before the regulators get involved." He still believed the cheap retainer agreement sitting on my plate possessed some magical authority. He thought my presence at the dinner was an opening for negotiation, a sign that I was willing to cross ethical boundaries to save my sister and her lavish lifestyle. He fundamentally misunderstood the purpose of my visit. I looked at the terrified faces of the family who had spent 25 years making me feel invisible. They were finally seeing me. They were seeing the razor-sharp intellect they had dismissed, the relentless work ethic they had mocked, and the formidable legal mind they had tried to subjugate. I reached back into the navy blue binder. I bypassed the bank statements, the forged deeds, and the fraudulent loan applications. I moved to the final section reserved for official firm correspondence. I withdrew a single sheet of thick, watermarked paper. The silence stretching across our booth felt heavy, suffocating the ambient noise of clinking silverware and jazz music drifting from the restaurant speakers. Carol stared at the closed blue binder resting on the table. Her mind, conditioned by decades of controlling every narrative, scrambled to process the wreckage. She could not accept that the power dynamic had permanently shifted. To her, every crisis was merely a public relations obstacle requiring the right spin. She looked up at me, her eyes darting frantically, searching for a loophole in my clinical delivery. She assumed my thorough investigation was a twisted display of loyalty. In her transactional worldview, I had gathered this damning intelligence specifically to protect them, uncovering the creditor's playbook so we could counter it. Carol smoothed her silk blouse, her breathing erratic but her voice striving for that familiar, commanding tone. "Well," she stammered the word, catching in her throat. "This is certainly a serious situation. You have obviously done your homework, Diana. You found all the leaks." She offered a fragile, trembling smile, leaning closer, as if bringing me into a conspiratorial huddle. "Since you know exactly what evidence they have, you can use this information to our advantage. You can reach out to the opposing counsel. We will draft a non-disclosure agreement. You can negotiate a quiet settlement before this goes to trial, correct? You can make this disappear if we just pay the right people." She still believed my legal expertise was a commodity she could direct. She thought the cheap printer paper sitting on my plate was still an option. She failed to comprehend that I had not brought the evidence to warn them. I watched my mother scramble to rearrange the pieces of her shattered illusion. Her desperation was palpable, radiating across the white linen tablecloth. Ashley was quietly hyperventilating next to her husband, her manicured fingers digging into the plush leather of the booth. My father remained frozen, his eyes locked on the spot where the offshore bank statements had sat moments prior. I did not offer the reassuring nod Carol desperately sought. Instead, I focused on the single sheet of thick watermarked paper I had just withdrawn from the final section of my binder. I brought the document into the amber light of the dining room. The paper was heavy with consequence. In the upper center of the page, catching the overhead illumination, the embossed gold logo of Pierce and Caldwell gleamed with pristine authority. It was a physical manifestation of elite corporate power forged in the crucible of Manhattan high finance. I laid the formal notice of litigation flat on the table. I placed my index finger on the top edge and slid the crisp white paper across the smooth cloth, stopping it directly in front of Bradley. Bradley stared down at the gleaming gold lettering. His eyes tracked the formal structured text beneath the firm heading. The color drained entirely from his face, leaving his skin a sickly pallid gray. His jaw trembled. He tried to swallow, but his throat appeared paralyzed. "I am not here to negotiate a settlement for you," I said smoothly, my voice resonant and unyielding. "I am not here to protect your assets, and I am certainly not here to represent you. My firm represents the primary institutional creditors you defrauded." The words landed with the precision of a surgical strike. The meaning took several seconds to penetrate the dense layers of entitlement surrounding my family. "I am the lead associate prosecuting this litigation," I continued, holding Bradley's terrified gaze. "I am the one who traced your offshore accounts. I discovered the phantom vendors in Cyprus. I identified the forged collateral schedules. I built the entire asset recovery strategy currently being executed against your holding companies." The room seemed to spin for the people sitting across from me. The fundamental laws of their universe collapsed. The daughter they had deemed worthless, the quiet spare child they had ordered to study in her bedroom so they could plan a lavish wedding, was not a helpless pawn. She was the architect of their impending ruin. Ashley let out a low, guttural sob, finally understanding the scope of the devastation. The woman she had mocked for driving a 10-year-old car and wearing thrifted blazers now held the power to seize her luxury vehicles and auction her vacation properties. My father slumped back against the leather booth. His commanding posture vanished, replaced by the hollow realization that his retirement funds were tied to a criminal enterprise targeted by a premier Manhattan law firm. He had co-signed fraudulent loans, and the prosecutor was his own flesh and blood. Carol shook her head in erratic, jerky movements. "No," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the restaurant ambiance. "You cannot do this. You cannot prosecute your own family. It is unethical. They will fire you." I disclosed the familial connection to my managing partner immediately. I informed her, my tone remaining factual and calm. "He authorized my continued leadership on this task force, specifically because my intimate knowledge of your financial dependencies provides a unique tactical advantage. We are not negotiating a settlement. We are seizing the stolen capital." I turned my attention back to Bradley, leaning slightly forward to deliver the legal reality of his situation. "You assumed you could execute a triangular merger to shield your domestic holding company from liability," I said, reciting the mechanics of his fraud. "You intended to dissolve the target subsidiary immediately post-closing, leaving the toxic debts behind while you walked away with the clean capital." Bradley flinched as I outlined his exact strategy. He had paid exorbitant fees to shadowy consultants to design that maneuver, believing it was impenetrable. "You invoked the de facto merger doctrine." I explained, the words flowing with the same icy clarity I had used on a cocktail napkin a year ago. "By continuing the exact same operations under the parent company, you triggered full successor liability. The corporate veil you thought would protect you is non-existent in this jurisdiction. Under the precedents established by New York appellate courts, the creditors have the absolute right to pierce that veil and target your personal assets. We are freezing your domestic operating accounts tomorrow morning." The exact legal snare I had dismantled for Jonathan Pierce during my impromptu dive bar interview was the precise trap Bradley had stumbled into. My managing partner had recognized my brilliance that evening, and now my brother-in-law was experiencing the devastating consequences of that same intellect. The ultimate twist of power settled over the dining table. My parents had spent 25 years treating me as a flawed investment, a disappointing line item on their emotional budget. They had poured all their resources, all their affection, and all their blind faith into Ashley and the flashy illusion her husband provided. They had engineered an ambush dinner, believing they could leverage my deep-seated fear of abandonment to force my compliance. They were staring at the embossed gold logo on the litigation notice, finally realizing that the fear was gone. I did not need their validation, their holiday dinners, or their conditional affection. I was a formidable entity, forged in the crucible of their neglect, and I was holding their entire financial existence in the palm of my hand. The quiet, invisible daughter had vanished, leaving only a relentless prosecutor in her wake. The silence following my declaration shattered with the sudden explosive force of a collapsing building. The carefully maintained illusion of the Lawrence family hierarchy disintegrated right there in the center of the upscale Midtown steakhouse. My father was the first to break the stillness. His face morphed from stunned disbelief into a deep, mottled crimson. He turned his head slowly toward the man sitting trapped on the inside of the leather booth. The paternal admiration he had showered on Bradley for years evaporated in a single instant, replaced by a raw, primal panic. "The loans," my father choked out, his voice barely a rasp, as the reality of successor liability set in. "The initial financing. You told me those luxury developments in Miami were fully collateralized. You swore the paperwork was just a formality to expedite the construction timeline." Bradley shrank back against the tufted leather upholstery, raising his hands in a weak defensive posture. He opened his mouth, searching for the smooth, persuasive buzzwords he usually deployed to charm investors, but his silver tongue failed him. He produced only a pathetic, stammering sound. "My house is on those documents," my father roared, no longer caring about the neighboring tables or the polite social contract of the restaurant. He leaned over the white linen, his face inches from his son-in-law. My entire retirement portfolio is tied to your shell companies. If the federal authorities freeze those accounts, we lose everything. You put my home on the line for a scam. The patriarch who had spent his entire life lecturing me about duty responsibility and the supreme importance of family loyalty was now watching his own financial security burn to the ground. He had trusted a charismatic fraudster over his own diligent daughter. He had co-signed fraudulent credit lines because he was too intoxicated by the illusion of proximity to wealth to read the fine print. Before Bradley could formulate an excuse, Ashley erupted. She did not express horror that the man she married was facing federal prison. She did not ask how he could commit wire fraud or betray the trust of her parents. Her reaction was entirely self-centered, focused exclusively on the evaporation of her material status. "My house!" Ashley wailed, her voice climbing to a shrill, hysterical pitch. She slapped her hands against the table, rattling the silverware. "What about the Hamptons property? We just signed the contract for the renovations. What about the country club memberships? How am I supposed to show my face at the charity gala next month if our accounts are frozen?" She burst into ugly, unfiltered sobs, her chest heaving as she gasped for air. The mascara she had carefully guarded earlier now ran down her cheeks in dark, messy streaks. Ashley had dropped out of law school to secure a life of effortless luxury, trading her own potential for the status Bradley provided. She had spent years looking down on my thrifted clothes and my cramped queen's apartment, assuming her elevated position was a permanent birthright. The realization that her designer wardrobe and leased imported vehicles were purchased with stolen institutional funds did not evoke moral outrage. It only evoked terror that the luxury was ending. She was weeping for her lost prestige, mourning the social standing that had defined her entire existence. Carol watched the chaos engulf her family, her eyes wide with a frantic, desperate need to regain control. For decades, my mother had operated as the supreme architect of our household narrative. She dictated who held value and who deserved punishment, effortlessly spinning every crisis to ensure her golden child remained untarnished. This disaster, however, could not be fixed with a stern lecture or a manipulative guilt trip. The federal indictments were inescapable, and the architect of their ruin was sitting right across the table, unable to contain the implosion of her favored daughter and her chosen son-in-law. Carol turned her fury toward the only target she had ever known how to attack. She locked her eyes on me, her features twisted with a venomous, unhinged wrath. "You planned this?" Carol hissed, her voice vibrating with irrational fury. She reached across the table, her hands trembling uncontrollably as the adrenaline flooded her system. "You have always envied your sister. You could never stand the fact that she was happy, that she had a beautiful life while you were stuck working in the background. You manufactured this entire prosecution just to tear her down." As she leaned forward to point an accusing finger at my face, her shaking hand clipped the delicate crystal stem of her wine glass. The heavy goblet tipped over. A full pour of expensive Cabernet spilled across the table. The dark red wine pooled rapidly, spreading outward and soaking deep into the pristine white tablecloth. It crept toward the edges like a fresh, undeniable stain, ruining the immaculate setting she had chosen for her ambush. Carol ignored the spilled wine soaking into the cuffs of her silk blouse. She kept her furious gaze fixed on my face, waiting for me to react to her venom. She expected me to defend myself, to argue against her absurd allegations, or to shrink back in shame as I had done throughout my childhood. I remained seated, a fortress of calm, amidst the hysterical wreckage of my family. I did not move to clean up the spilled wine. I did not flinch from her accusation. I simply watched her, feeling a profound sense of clarity wash over me. The emotional extortion that had kept me captive for 25 years no longer possessed any power. "I didn't destroy anything," I replied, my voice steady, carrying an icy, unyielding resonance. "You chose to invest all your love and money into a fraud, while ignoring the daughter who actually did the work." The words struck her with physical force. Her mouth opened, but the furious accusations died in her throat. "You treated this family like a balance sheet," I continued, holding her stunned gaze. "You evaluated Ashley as a premium asset and funded her accordingly. You viewed me as a liability, withholding your support, your pride, and your basic affection because my ambition did not serve your aesthetic goals. You were so desperate to project an image of effortless superiority that you handed your entire financial security over to a man who sells illusions. I looked at my father, who was still staring at Bradley with murderous intent, and then at my sister, who was burying her tear-streaked face in her hands. You ran the numbers, I said, my tone clinical and precise, rendering my final verdict on the Lawrence family economy. You calculated your affections based on projected returns, and you did the math wrong. I did not set this trap. Bradley built it, and you all walked into it willingly because you were blinded by greed and superficial status. Now the bill has come due, and I am the one collecting it for my client. I forced them to look at the undeniable devastation they had engineered. Their transactional love had backfired spectacularly. The golden child was exposed as a catastrophic liability. The prized son-in-law was a federal criminal facing years in prison. The parents who had smugly planned a lavish wedding over my law school textbooks were now facing the imminent foreclosure of their suburban home. They sat frozen in the ruins of their own making, the red wine continuing to drip slowly from the edge of the table onto the thick restaurant carpet. The chaos had finally burned itself out, leaving nothing but the cold, harsh reality of their impending ruin. I had delivered the truth they had spent a lifetime avoiding, and there was nothing left for me to say. The crimson stain of the spilled Cabernet continued its slow, erratic crawl across the pristine white linen, reaching the edge of the table and dripping silently onto the patterned carpet below. Nobody moved to stop it. The vibrant red drops fell like a metronome, ticking away the final seconds of the Lawrence family illusion. Bradley remained frozen in the circular booth, his chest rising and falling in shallow, panicked rhythms, his eyes fixed on the empty space where his financial security had just been systematically dismantled. Ashley had buried her face in her manicured hands, her earlier performative sniffles devolving into pathetic, wet wheezing. Carol sat rigid, the muscles in her neck taut, her jaw locked tight as she processed the evaporation of her pristine social standing. They formed a striking portrait of impending ruin, framed by the opulent mahogany and gleaming brass of the Midtown steakhouse they had selected for my ambush. I reached across the stained tablecloth, bypassing the generic, useless retainer agreement they had expected me to sign with blind obedience. My fingers closed around the thick cover of the navy blue binder. I pulled it toward me, the movement deliberate and unhurried. I lifted the heavy volume, feeling the substantial weight of the evidence secured inside its silver rings, and slid it back into my leather briefcase. I snapped the brass latches shut. The sharp metallic clicks echoed like a gavel striking a block, signaling the definitive end of the proceedings. I pushed my chair back, the wooden legs gliding smoothly over the plush carpet. I stood up, smoothing the front of my tailored blazer. The physical act of rising altered the spatial dynamics of the dining area. For my entire existence, I had made myself small to accommodate their outsized egos, shrinking into the background so my sister could effortlessly dominate the spotlight. Now I towered over them. I looked down at the four individuals who had engineered my lifelong isolation, feeling no pity, no lingering resentment, and no desire to offer a comforting lie. My father watched me gather my coat. The sight of my imminent departure triggered a desperate reactionary instinct deep within his psyche. His authority, the patriarchal control he had wielded like a blunt instrument throughout my childhood, was slipping through his fingers like dry sand. He could not stop the federal indictments. He could not stop the imminent foreclosure of his suburban home. He could not erase the signatures on the fraudulent loan documents. But he could not fathom allowing his designated scapegoat to simply walk away without yielding to his command one final time. "Sit down, Diana," he ordered. His voice was hoarse, a ragged imitation of his usual booming command stripped of its underlying power. "We are not finished here. We have a crisis to manage, and you are not walking out on your family." I slung the heavy leather strap of my briefcase over my shoulder. "The crisis belongs to you. The prosecution belongs to me. There is nothing left to manage." He slammed his fist against the table, rattling the silver flatware and causing another splash of wine to hit the floor. He looked around, his eyes landing on the expensive, untouched cuts of prime beef and the premium side dishes cooling on the porcelain plates. The reality of his drained bank accounts clashed harshly with the exorbitant prices printed on the leather-bound menu. He pointed a trembling finger at my chest. "You are paying for this dinner," he demanded, his tone a venomous mixture of entitlement and spite. "You make that big law money now. You owe us at least that much. Do not think you can just strut out of here and leave us with the check after pulling a stunt like this." The sheer absurdity of his demand hung in the air, heavy and ridiculous. He was facing the loss of his entire retirement portfolio, yet his immediate concern was forcing me to subsidize their extravagant meal. It was the ultimate distillation of their transactional parenting. Even in the face of total devastation, they viewed me solely as a resource to be exploited, a wallet to be emptied when their preferred investments failed. I looked at the luxurious spread before them. The dry, aged steaks remained uncut. The truffle-roasted potatoes were turning cold. The expensive appetizers were pushed aside. It was a feast intended to celebrate my subjugation, ordered on a budget of stolen funds they could no longer access. They had planned to chew on expensive meat while I signed my career away on a piece of printer paper. The waiter assigned to our section approached cautiously, sensing the volatile shift in the atmosphere. He carried a sleek black leather folder containing the itemized bill. He hesitated, his professional demeanor faltering as he surveyed the crying woman, the sweating men, and the wine-stained cloth. He held the folder uncertainly, unsure of who should receive the astronomical total in the midst of a silent standoff. I reached into my purse. I bypassed my credit cards and extracted my slim leather wallet. My fingers located a crisp, newly minted $100 bill. I pulled the currency free. The thick paper produced a sharp, distinct snap as I pulled it taut between my hands. The sound was crisp and clean, cutting through the suffocating tension enveloping the booth, drawing the eyes of my parents like a magnet. I bypassed my father's outstretched hand. I stepped toward the waiter and extended the currency directly to him. He looked at the bill, then up at my face, a question forming in his professional gaze. "This is for you," I told the waiter, ensuring my voice carried clearly enough for the entire table to hear. "This covers your gratuity for the evening. Your service was excellent and you should not be penalized for the behavior of this table, but under no circumstances does this money go toward their outstanding balance. Do you understand?" The waiter nodded quickly, a flash of gratitude crossing his features. He slipped the bill into his apron pocket with a discreet, appreciative glance. He stepped back, leaving the black leather folder resting perilously close to the edge of the table, right next to my father's empty plate. I turned back to the booth. I looked at my mother, whose face had crumpled into an expression of terrified realization. I looked at Ashley, still weeping over her lost country club status. I looked at Bradley, staring vacantly into the abyss of his impending incarceration. Finally, I looked at my father, who was staring at the black leather folder as if it contained a live explosive. "You can figure out the bill," I said, my tone carrying the smooth, indifferent finality of a closing argument. "You have always been good at adapting." I turned my back on them. I did not wait for a response. I did not pause to gauge their reactions, to absorb their shock, or to bask in the destruction of their pristine facade. The physical act of turning away severed the invisible tether that had bound me to their dysfunction for 2.5 decades. I walked through the crowded dining room, my posture straight, my stride measured and confident. The murmurs of the surrounding patrons, the clatter of plates, and the soft jazz music faded into insignificant background noise. I pushed through the heavy glass doors of the steakhouse and stepped out onto the vibrant, pulsing sidewalks of Midtown Manhattan. The cold evening air hit my face, crisp and invigorating. The city towered above me, a landscape of towering skyscrapers and endless glowing windows. I took a deep breath, filling my lungs with the chaotic, electric energy of the metropolis. For the first time in my existence, I felt no lingering guilt, no heavy obligation, and no desperate yearning for validation from people incapable of providing it. I had reclaimed my autonomy. I had left the abusers to drown in the shallow waters of their own deceit. The scapegoat was gone, and the attorney was walking into the night untethered and unbroken, ready to finish the job. The machinery of federal justice moves with a glacial, unyielding momentum, but when it finally strikes, the impact is total. Over the subsequent 8 weeks, the reality I had outlined in that Midtown steakhouse materialized with devastating precision. I sat at my mahogany desk on the 40th floor of Pierce and Caldwell, reviewing the digital docket updates as the Southern District of New York formally unsealed the indictment against Bradley Hayes. The charges were comprehensive: wire fraud, bank fraud, and interstate financial manipulation formed the foundation of the government's case. The federal prosecutors did not offer leniency, and the presiding judges showed zero inclination to grant bail to a flight risk defendant holding offshore capital. Our Asset Recovery Task Force executed the freeze orders simultaneously. I orchestrated the injunctions alongside Jonathan Pierce, ensuring every foreign account, domestic holding entity, and dummy corporation tied to my brother-in-law was locked down. I watched the financial data flow across my dual monitors, tracking the exact moment Bradley's access to his stolen wealth evaporated. The luxury vehicles were impounded by federal agents. The Hamptons property renovation was halted mid-construction, the contractors walking off the site the second the escrow accounts ran dry. Ashley's curated life of effortless prestige vanished overnight, replaced by the grim reality of asset forfeiture and unending legal scrutiny. The collateral damage expanded exactly as I had predicted. The commercial loans Bradley had secured required tangible backing, and my parents had willingly offered their entire financial foundation to prop up his illusion. When the primary borrower defaulted and the federal government seized the remaining capital, the institutional lenders immediately triggered the acceleration clauses on the co-signed notes. The suburban home my parents had prized above all else, the immaculate white colonial where they had hosted countless neighborhood associations and planned my sister's lavish wedding, became bank property. The foreclosure notices were drafted, stamped, and posted on their heavy wooden front door. Their descent into panic was swift and predictable. Cut off from their golden son-in-law and facing the imminent loss of their residence, my parents turned their desperation toward the daughter they had discarded. They did not possess my personal cell phone number, having never bothered to ask for it when I upgraded my device a year prior. Instead, they routed their frantic inquiries through the main switchboard of Pierce and Caldwell. The voicemail indicator on my office phone became a persistent blinking red light. I did not answer the incoming calls. I allowed the digital recording system to capture their escalating hysteria. At the end of each grueling workday before packing my briefcase, I would press the playback button and listen to the audio files in the quiet sanctuary of my office. The first few messages were laced with residual entitlement. My father demanded I return his call immediately, insisting that I needed to clarify the situation with the banks and halt the foreclosure process. He still clung to the delusion that he possessed authority over my actions, speaking to me as if I were a truant teenager, rather than the attorney prosecuting his family's ruin. As the weeks progressed, and the reality of their destitution set in, the tone shifted drastically. The demands dissolved into frantic bargaining and eventually pathetic begging. My mother left a 5-minute voicemail detailing her humiliation. She described the cardboard moving boxes stacked in her pristine living room and the whispers of the neighbors who had witnessed the bank representatives inspecting the property. She pleaded for a personal loan, citing her advancing age and the unbearable stress of finding a rental unit with ruined credit. Her voice cracked as she invoked the concept of family duty, begging me to remember the times she had sheltered me and fed me, attempting to rewrite a history of neglect into a tapestry of maternal sacrifice. I sat in my ergonomic chair, the city lights of Manhattan glowing through the floor-to-ceiling windows, and listened to her tears echoing from the speakerphone. I analyzed my own internal response, searching for a trace of remorse, a flicker of residual guilt, or a sudden biological urge to rescue them from their self-inflicted poverty. I found nothing. The reservoir of empathy I might have once held for them had been drained dry decades ago. They had spent my entire childhood treating me as a defective investment, a line item that yielded no desirable social return. They had starved me of affection, ridiculed my ambition, and attempted to weaponize my legal expertise to protect a criminal. Now that their preferred asset had collapsed in spectacular fashion, they expected me to function as their emergency parachute. I viewed their pleas through the clinical lens they had taught me to use. They were a toxic liability. I had spent years learning how to balance ledgers and audit complex financial structures. I knew exactly how to handle an unprofitable account. You do not pour fresh capital into a bankrupt enterprise. You close the file, you write off the loss, you sever the connection permanently. I opened a new document on my computer and began to type. I did not draft a heartfelt letter outlining my grievances, nor did I write an angry email detailing the pain of my upbringing. Emotional responses invited further engagement, providing the abuser with a foothold to continue the dialogue. I intended to terminate this relationship permanently. I utilized the precise sterile language of my profession to construct an impenetrable fortress. I drafted a formal cease and desist directive. I outlined their pattern of repeated unwanted contact through my corporate switchboard, attaching a logged schedule of their calls. I cited specific New York State penal laws regarding aggravated harassment in the second degree and stalking behaviors. I explicitly stated that any further attempts to contact me, whether at my residence, my place of employment, or through third-party intermediaries, would be met with immediate requests for judicial restraining orders and civil litigation. I printed the document on the heavy watermark stationery of Pierce & Caldwell. I signed my name at the bottom, my signature sharp and definitive in dark blue ink. The document was a legal barricade devoid of familial sentiment or lingering sorrow. It reduced our relationship to a binding contract of mutual non-interference. I did not mail the letter through standard postal channels. A situation of this magnitude required undeniable proof of receipt. I engaged the services of a premium process serving agency favored by the firm for high-risk corporate deliveries. I provided them with the address of the foreclosed suburban home and strict instructions for personal service. I wanted them to understand that I was treating them exactly like any other hostile opposing party. 3 days later, the confirmation arrived. I was reviewing a deposition transcript in the firm's law library when my phone buzzed with an incoming email notification. I opened the message. The text was brief, devoid of any narrative flair or emotional weight. It was a standard delivery confirmation generated by the agency's automated tracking software. Attached was a scanned copy of the affidavit of service. The process server, a man who executed these tasks with mechanical indifference, had intercepted my parents as they were loading boxes into a rented moving truck in their driveway. He had handed the heavy envelope directly to my mother, confirming her identity before turning and walking away without a single word of explanation. I read the short, sterile email twice. The process server's indifferent verification was the perfect conclusion to the ordeal. There was no dramatic final confrontation, no screaming match on a manicured suburban lawn, no tearful goodbyes demanding closure. The boundary had been enforced by a stranger holding a clipboard, reducing their lifelong tyranny to a bureaucratic transaction. I archived the email and placed my phone face down on the polished wooden table. The silence that followed was not heavy or oppressive. It was light, expansive, and entirely mine. The legal mechanism had functioned flawlessly, severing the final tether to my past. I closed the deposition file, gathered my notes, and prepared to walk back to my office, leaving the wreckage of the Lawrence family securely trapped behind a wall of undeniable jurisprudence. The October wind slicing off the East River carried the same sharp chill it had exactly 1 year ago. I walked along the perimeter of Foley Square, watching the dead leaves scatter across the gray pavement. 12 months prior, I had stood on this exact street corner, clutching a phone that broadcast my admission to the New York bar, waiting for a mother who prioritized interior decorating over my existence. Today, I did not check my screen for missed calls. My phone rested silently in the pocket of a tailored cashmere coat, free from the frantic demands of people who only valued me as a convenient resource. My stride was measured and secure, anchored by the weight of a landmark legal victory and a future I had forged entirely on my own terms. I turned the corner and approached the familiar stone facade of the oaken gavel. The heavy brass-handled doors yielded smoothly to my push. The interior embraced me with the comforting aroma of floor wax, aged leather, and expensive scotch. The tavern hummed with the steady low cadence of the evening crowd. Litigators traded war stories over neat bourbon. Judges relaxed in the shadowed booths. It was the epicenter of Manhattan jurisprudence, a sanctuary for those who thrived in the crucible of high-stakes conflict. Last year I had retreated to the darkest corner of the mahogany bar, seeking a quiet place to swallow my isolation. Tonight, I did not sit alone. I walked toward the spacious circular leather booth situated at the rear of the main dining room. 4 people were already seated, their conversation animated and sharp. Jonathan Pierce sat at the center, nursing a crystal tumbler of his preferred reserve. Flanking him were Rachel Evans, our lead appellate strategist, David Costa, a veteran forensic accountant who had helped me dissect the Cayman Island transfers, and Thomas Reed, a senior litigator known for his merciless cross-examinations. These were the elite architects of Pierce & Caldwell professionals, who commanded exorbitant billing rates and rarely suffered fools. They made room for me the moment I approached the table. There was no hesitation, no subtle hierarchy dictating my place. I slid into the booth, taking my seat beside Pierce. We were celebrating the formal conclusion of the fraud prosecution. That morning, a federal judge in the Southern District of New York had handed down a definitive ruling. Bradley was sentenced to a lengthy term in federal prison, his remaining hidden assets fully liquidated to satisfy the institutional creditors. The complex web of offshore shell companies had been dismantled. Our client, the premier investment bank, recovered their stolen capital, and our firm secured a historic settlement fee. I had served as the lead associate on the Asset Recovery Task Force from the first day to the final gavel strike. I had deposed the phantom vendors, traced the fraudulent wire transfers, and built the unassailable fortress of evidence that forced the defense into an unconditional surrender. Pierce set his tumbler down on the thick cardboard coaster. He looked around the table, his slate-gray eyes settling on me. He did not offer hollow praise or saccharine sentiment. He spoke with the clinical, measured respect that served as the highest form of currency in our world. The partners convened this afternoon, Pierce stated, his baritone voice cutting through the ambient noise of the pub. The executive committee reviewed the recovery metrics and the strategic execution of the prosecution. Your performance was flawless, Diana. You anticipated every evasive maneuver the defense attempted. You protected the client and you elevated the reputation of this firm. He paused, reaching into the breast pocket of his charcoal suit. He extracted a sleek silver pen and a thick envelope, sliding the heavy paper across the table toward me. Effective tomorrow morning, you are no longer a junior associate, Pierce announced. The committee voted unanimously to bypass the standard timeline. You are officially elevated to senior counsel, focusing exclusively on complex financial litigation. You earned every inch of this promotion. Rachel raised her glass in a silent salute. David and Thomas voiced their approval, their congratulations genuine and grounded in shared trench warfare. I looked at the envelope resting on the table, bearing my name in elegant embossed lettering. I absorbed the reality of the moment. I sat in a booth surrounded by people who demanded excellence, who scrutinized every legal brief and analyzed every strategic decision with unforgiving precision. They did not care about my genetics, my childhood obedience, or my ability to cater to their personal vanities. They evaluated me strictly on the sharpness of my intellect and the relentless grit I brought to the negotiating table. This was the true definition of family. The concept of family had nothing to do with biological ties or shared last names. It was not a transactional budget where affection was withheld as punishment. Family consisted of the people who recognized your worth when you had nothing to offer but hard work. It was the mentors who tested your limits to make you stronger, and the colleagues who stood shoulder to shoulder with you in the darkest hours of a grueling investigation. The people sitting at this table had seen me at my most exhausted, poring over bank statements at 2 a.m, and they had respected the fire that kept me going. My parents and my sister were strangers who merely shared my DNA. They had demanded my loyalty while simultaneously erasing my identity. I felt a profound, settling peace knowing I would never again sit across a table from them, waiting for a validation they were incapable of providing. I had closed that unprofitable account permanently. A shadow fell across the polished wood of our booth. Mac, the veteran bartender, stood beside the table. He carried a condensation-covered silver bucket. Nestled inside the crushed ice was a bottle of vintage champagne, its foil wrapper catching the amber light of the pub. He held 5 crystal flutes expertly balanced between his fingers. "I saw the breaking news on the financial monitors this afternoon," Mac said, his low, gravelly voice carrying a note of distinct pride. "A 9-figure recovery. That is a rare victory in this district." He placed the crystal flutes on the table and retrieved the bottle from the ice. He popped the cork with a muted professional sigh, the carbonation releasing a faint wisp of white vapor. He poured the pale golden liquid, the tiny bubbles rushing to the surface in a frantic, joyful cascade. "This vintage is on the house," Mac declared, setting the bottle back into the silver bucket. He looked directly at me, his sharp eyes crinkling at the corners. "1 year ago, I told a certain managing partner that I had hungry talent sitting at my bar. It appears my assessment was accurate." Pierce picked up his crystal flute. "Your judgment remains impeccable, Mac. She possesses a very specific kind of hunger, the kind that builds empires." Mac offered a brief, respectful nod and returned to his station behind the long mahogany counter. Pierce raised his glass, holding it steady in the center of the table. Rachel, David, and Thomas followed suit. I wrapped my fingers around the delicate stem of my own flute and lifted it to join theirs. The crystal rang with a clear, resonant chime as our glasses met. "To Diana," Pierce said, "and to the relentless pursuit of the truth." I took a slow sip of the champagne. The liquid was crisp, bright, and tasted like undeniable victory. As I lowered the glass, my gaze drifted past my colleagues, extending across the crowded room toward the long, polished bar, where my journey had truly begun. My eyes scanned the tall, mirrored shelves backing the counter, tracing the rows of imported spirits and rare bourbons. They're mounted securely on the dark oak paneling right next to the top shelf. Whiskey was a small square frame, crafted from rich cherry wood. Inside the glass rested a flimsy white paper cocktail napkin. Even from across the room, I could see the faded blue ink bleeding into the porous fibers. I could trace the jagged lines, the intersecting boxes, and the sweeping arrows of the complex triangular merger scenario Jonathan Pierce had drawn exactly 12 months ago. It was the precise legal trap I had dismantled to prove my worth. Mac had kept it. He had recognized the silent seismic shift that occurred at his bar that afternoon, and he had preserved the evidence. The framed napkin was not just a quirky piece of tavern decor, it was a tangible artifact. It was the physical proof of the exact moment I stopped waiting for my family to value me and decided to forge my own destiny. It represented the death of the invisible, discarded daughter and the birth of a woman who commanded respect in the most unforgiving city in the world. I looked back at the colleagues sitting around me, feeling the warmth of the vintage champagne settling in my chest. I did not need the Lawrence family to acknowledge my existence. I did not need their conditional love or their toxic hierarchy. I had walked into the wilderness they created, and I had built my own empire out of the stones they threw at me. The October wind continued to howl outside the heavy doors of the pub, rattling the glass and stripping the autumn leaves from the trees. But inside, the fire was burning bright, and I was exactly where I was meant to be.
We often picture the traditional American family gathered around a sturdy mahogany dining table, passing plates of warm food shielded from the harsh, competitive winds of the outside world. We imagine a sanctuary. But what happens when that table ceases to be a place of refuge and quietly morphs into a corporate ledger? In the relentless pursuit of the modern dream, where success is frequently quantified by exclusive zip codes, pristine lawns, and leased luxury, the definition of family can warp without anyone noticing. We watched this exact tragedy unfold in Diana's journey. Her story transcends the boundaries of a simple legal drama. It operates as a profound mirror held up to the silent, creeping crises that infect modern parenting. In a society that relentlessly praises the visible markers of status, it becomes dangerously easy for parents to treat their affection as a finite currency distributed only to the investments that yield the highest social return. We saw Diana's parents pour their time, resources, and emotional bandwidth into Ashley the golden child, blinding themselves to her lack of substance because she offered the right aesthetic. They eagerly bought into the imported suits, the country club memberships, and the hollow promises peddled by her husband. They mistook a sleek manufactured facade for genuine character. This is the fatal illusion of transactional parenting. When we measure a child's worth by how well their achievements reflect our own ambitions, we stop raising human beings and start managing assets. We inadvertently teach them that love is a dividend paid out only when the performance metrics meet our expectations. The child who fails to deliver that specific shallow return, the quiet, diligent one studying late into the night without a cheering section, is systematically written off as a loss. We forget that true human value rarely gleams under the bright lights of a cocktail party. It is forged in the quiet, lonely hours of unseen labor. Raising children with integrity requires a ruthless, unflinching honesty, and that honesty must start with ourselves. It demands that we strip away our own ego and look at our children as sovereign individuals, rather than extensions of our unresolved desires or tools to mend our own insecurities. The tragedy of the family sitting across from Diana in that Midtown steakhouse was not just their impending financial ruin, it was their profound lack of emotional awareness. They built a rigid hierarchy to soothe their own anxieties. To maintain that structure, they engaged in chronic unfairness, forcing one daughter into the shadows so the other could catch all the light. When parents refuse to recognize the unique inherent worth of every child, the foundation of the home begins to rot from the inside out. True fairness within a traditional family structure is not merely about dividing an inheritance equally or keeping track of gifts. It is about distributing presence, respect, and validation without demanding a receipt. It requires the emotional intelligence to listen, to observe, and to value a child's internal compass over their external accolades. When the truth of the devastating fraud was laid bare on that white linen tablecloth, the parents could not handle the reflection of their own poor judgment. Instead of demonstrating the emotional maturity to admit fault and apologize to the daughter they had neglected, they attacked the person who had finally turned on the lights. They demanded she sacrifice her professional ethics to shield them from the consequences of their own greed. In that moment, they lost the moral authority to call themselves parents. Cultivating a healthy environment means fostering an unconditional commitment that remains steady, whether a child brings home a six-figure salary, a prestigious degree, or a broken heart. We must teach our children that their character, their resilience, their honesty, their grit is the only currency that truly endures. When we shield a favored child from the consequences of their actions, we cripple their ability to navigate the real world. When we demand that another child suppress their own truth to protect the family's fragile reputation, we bankrupt our own moral standing. The hardest, most vital work of parenting is not securing a college fund or a prime piece of real estate. It is managing our own internal darkness, ensuring our vanity and our blind spots do not become the heavy burdens our children must carry. Diana's decision to stand up from that booth, to hand the waiter a crisp $100 bill, and walk out into the cold New York night was not an act of cruelty. It was an act of profound, necessary survival. It represents the monumental courage required to sever a cycle of generational dysfunction. Her departure forces us to realize that raising a family is essentially a lifelong journey of self-cultivation. We cannot mold our children into resilient, honorable adults if we are unwilling to confront our own flaws. A home only functions as a safe harbor when the people steering the ship possess the wisdom to navigate by the stars of empathy and truth, rather than the false flickering lighthouses of pride and materialism. If this reflection struck a chord with you, if you have ever had to build your own sanctuary because the one you were given was flawed, you are in the right place. Subscribe to Orange Vengeance, where we explore the quiet strength it takes to walk away and the power of letting the truth speak for itself. Hit the notification bell so you never miss a story that understands your journey. As the city lights reflect off the damp pavement and the noise of the crowd fades into the distance, we are left to ponder the spaces we create for the people we claim to love. Think about the chairs pulled up to your own dining table. Consider the expectations resting on the shoulders of those sitting in them. Are they free to be exactly who they are? Or are they quietly suffocating under the weight of a role you assigned them? The answers we find in the silence might just change the trajectory of the lives we touch. Sometimes the most important legacy we leave behind is not the wealth we accumulate, but the generational chains we finally find the strength to break.